Harold Sutton didn't look like someone who was about to walk into the most important room of his career. He looked like someone who had stopped at a gas station on the way there and hadn't quite recovered from the fluorescent lighting. His jacket was the same one he'd worn to his wife's funeral 4 years ago, let out at the shoulders by a tailor in Akron who charged $40 and did good work. His laptop bag had a fraying strap that he'd fixed twice with electrical tape and once with a zip tie. His daughter Penny, 9 years old, gap-toothed, wearing a backpack shaped like a ladybug, was holding his hand as they walked through the revolving doors of the Meridian Conference Center in downtown Cleveland. Harold hadn't planned to bring her. He hadn't planned for a lot of things lately. The plan had been for his sister to take Penny for the afternoon. The plan had also been for the check engine light to not come on at the exit ramp, for the registration confirmation email to not vanish into a spam folder, and for the woman at the credentialing desk to not look at Harold's face, and then at the laptop bag, and then back at Harold's face with that particular brand of patience that was not patience at all. "Sir, I'm going to need you to wait over there," she said. Harold waited over there. The Meridian Conference Center was hosting the Midwest Infrastructure Summit. 3 days of panels and keynotes and breakout sessions for the people who ran the operational backbone of the region's utilities, logistics networks, and municipal systems. Harold had been invited not as a speaker, not as a vendor, but as an independent consultant who had flagged something 3 weeks ago that he wasn't sure anyone had taken seriously. He had submitted the report through the proper channel. He had followed up twice. He had received one automated response and one email from an administrative coordinator named Tonya, who said she had forwarded his concern to the relevant team. He was here because the summit was starting its live demonstration at 2 o'clock, and the relevant team had not called him back. Penny sat on a bench near the credentialing desk and took a library book out of her ladybug backpack. She was reading about volcanoes. She had been reading about volcanoes for 2 weeks. Harold watched her for a moment and felt the specific exhaustion of a man who had learned to keep his feelings in a particular drawer and only open it when no one was looking. He turned back to the credentialing desk. The woman, her name tag said Renata, was speaking to a man in a blazer now, someone who had arrived after Harold and was already being handed a lanyard. Harold didn't say anything. He stood where he had been told to stand and held his confirmation number on his phone and waited. What he did not do in that moment was show any sign of what he actually knew. He had spent 22 years in infrastructure systems, the last 9 as an independent analyst who was hired when something wasn't working and needed to be found. He had worked on water treatment networks in 3 states. He had consulted for 2 of the largest freight logistics companies in the Midwest. He had, on one occasion that he did not put on his public resume, helped a federal agency understand how a regional power grid had been quietly compromised for 11 months before anyone noticed. The laptop in the bag with the zip-tied strap contained 730 pages of documentation. None of that was visible from where Renata was standing. A woman in a white blazer crossed the lobby at speed. She had the kind of walk that suggested she was always late to the next thing she was already running. She was on a phone call and gesturing with one hand at someone 20 feet away who was scrambling to catch up. Her lanyard had 3 credential badges on it. Her name, Harold would learn later, was Catherine Holt. She was the chief operating officer of the summit's lead sponsor, a logistic technology company called Axiom Relay, and she was, at that precise moment, 40 minutes away from overseeing the live demonstration of the platform. She had spent 2 years and $40 million building. She did not look at Harold. She looked past him, through him, in the way that people with lanyards look past people without them. Then something made her stop. Harold could not have told you what it was. Maybe she was checking the room. Maybe she was looking for her assistant. But she stopped, and she looked at Harold, And then she looked at Penny on the bench with the volcano book, and then she looked at the laptop bag, and something in her expression shifted. "Renata," Catherine Holt said. "Yes, Ms. Holt. What's the situation here?" Renata explained the situation. Missing confirmation in the system. Couldn't verify credentials. Gentleman had been waiting. Catherine Holt looked at Harold again. He met her gaze without expression, which was, as it happened, the most unnerving thing he could have done. "What's your name?" she said. "Harold Sutton." "And what are you here for, Mr. Sutton?" "I submitted a vulnerability report to your technical liaison 3 weeks ago," Harold said. "I have a concern about the Axiom Relay demonstration platform. I'd like to speak with someone from your architecture team before 2 o'clock. Catherine Holt had built a company from 30 people in a converted warehouse in Dayton to 400 employees in 6 cities. She had a talent, a genuine talent, for reading rooms and people and situations very fast. She used that talent now. What she saw was a man in an old jacket with a child on a bench and a laptop with a zip-tied strap. What she heard was a sentence that contained the words vulnerability report and architecture team. What she felt was the kind of mild irritation that comes from a problem that is almost certainly not a problem arriving at the worst possible time. "What kind of concern?" she said, and her voice had already made the decision about the answer before she asked the question. Harold said the concern was specific to how the platform handled real-time data handoffs during high concurrency load events. He said there was a validation gap in the authentication layer that could be exploited. He said he had documented it in detail and had the documentation with him. Catherine Holt nodded in the way people nod when they have stopped listening. "We have a full technical team on site," she said. "Our systems have been reviewed by 3 independent firms." "I'm aware," Harold said. "I've read 2 of those reviews. The gap I'm describing wasn't in scope for either of them." She looked at the laptop bag. She looked at Penny, who had looked up from her book briefly and then looked back down. "Mr. Sutton," Catherine Holt said, not unkindly, with the tone of someone who had learned to fire people gently, "I appreciate you taking the time. But we're 90 minutes from a live demonstration to 400 infrastructure executives. I'm not going to bring an uncredentialed walk-in into my technical floor based on—" She paused, and her eyes went to the bag again. "A report that wasn't logged in our system." Harold didn't argue. He didn't say what he was thinking, which was that the report hadn't been logged because the intake portal had a broken confirmation email function, something he had noted in the report itself. He didn't say that the 3 independent review firms she'd mentioned had all used the same base framework, which meant they had all missed the same thing in the same way. He didn't say any of it. He said, "I understand. Could I leave the documentation with someone on your team? Not to delay anything. Just so it's on record before the demo starts." Catherine Holt signaled to her assistant, a young man, Parker, who was always behind her by 8 feet, and said something to him in a low voice. Parker nodded and came to Harold and held out his hand for the documentation. Harold looked at Parker for a moment. "It's 700 pages, he said. Parker's hand stayed out. Harold reached into his bag and pulled out a thumb drive. Parker took it with the careful neutrality of someone whose job was to absorb things. "The key findings are in the executive summary," Harold said, "pages 1 through 4. Parker nodded and walked away. Catherine Holt was already moving. Harold stood in the lobby of the Meridian Conference Center and watched her go, and then he went and sat next to Penny on the bench, and Penny showed him a picture of Krakatoa, and he looked at it and said it was something. The demonstration hall on the 3rd floor was set up like a product launch event for people who would have been embarrassed to be seen at a product launch event. There were no flashy lights or hype tracks. There were rows of chairs and a presentation screen and a stage with a single podium, and at the back, a live system display. Axiom Relay's platform running in real time, processing actual logistics data from 6 regional partners who had agreed to participate in the demo. That last part was one of the things Harold had flagged. using live production data in a demonstration environment with real authentication tokens on a system that had never been stress-tested at public summit scale. With 400 people logged onto the conference center's network at the same time, Harold had described this as a decision that significantly expanded the attack surface beyond controlled parameters. He had used those exact words in the executive summary on page 1. He did not know whether Parker had read it. He did not know whether anyone had. He was sitting in the lobby with Penny, reading the part about Krakatoa where it talks about the sound being heard in Australia when the demo started. He knew it had started because the energy in the lobby changed. People who had been circulating drifted toward the elevators. The credentialing desk went quiet. Renata took a sip of coffee. Harold took out his own laptop, the one in the bag with the zip-tied strap, and opened it. It was not an impressive machine to look at. The hinge had a crack in it that he'd fixed with a strip of aluminum and 2 small bolts. The keyboard had letters worn off the A and the S and the E. The fan ran a little loud. What it was running was a passive network analysis tool that Harold had written himself over the course of about 6 years, updating it every time he found something that standard tools missed. He opened it and looked at the Meridian's public network, the one that all 400 people in that room were on, and he looked at what was happening to it. For about 90 seconds, nothing was visibly wrong. Harold read the part about how the ash cloud from Krakatoa lowered global temperatures for a year and a half. Then something happened on his screen that made him sit up straighter. It was not dramatic, the way it looked. It was a pattern in the authentication handshakes, a small rhythmic irregularity that most monitoring tools would have flagged as noise and ignored. Harold's tool did not ignore it, because Harold had written it specifically not to ignore that. Someone was probing the validation gap, not attacking it yet, probing it, testing the edges, which meant they knew it was there, and they were deciding whether to go in. Harold closed the volcano book gently and handed it to Penny. "Stay here," he said. "Don't move. I'll be right back." Penny looked up. "Dad." "Right back." He went to the credentialing desk. "I need to speak to someone from the Axiom Relay technical team," he said to Renata. "Right now. It's not a concern anymore. It's active." Renata looked at him. "The demonstration is in progress, sir. I can't." "I understand that," Harold said in a voice he had used once in a county utility emergency and twice in situations he didn't discuss. "I need you to get someone on the phone, not in 10 minutes now." Something in his voice made Renata pick up the desk phone. She reached Parker. Parker said he'd pass it along. Harold asked Renata to tell Parker that the word he wanted to use was active, and to please say that word out loud when he delivered the message. Parker delivered the message. 3 minutes passed. On Harold's laptop, the probing had become structured. Whoever was doing it was experienced and patient. They were not in yet, but they were going to be. A man came down from the 3rd floor. He had a technical team badge and the focused displeasure of someone pulled out of a room where things had just started going well. His name was Glenn, according to his lanyard, and he was the platform's lead integration engineer. "You're the walk-in from downstairs," Glenn said. "Harold Sutton. I submitted a report 3 weeks ago. I need to show you something." Glenn looked at the laptop with the aluminum-patched hinge. He looked at Harold. He looked at Penny, who was watching them from the bench. "We've had 3 independent security reviews," Glenn said. "Look at my screen," Harold said. Glenn looked at the screen. Harold showed him the handshake pattern. He talked for approximately 45 seconds, using precise technical language, pointing at specific values in the data stream. He did not editorialize. He did not say, "I told you so," or "I've been trying to reach someone for 3 weeks," or "Your boss looked at my bag and made a decision that had nothing to do with my report." He just showed Glenn what was on the screen. Glenn's expression changed. It was not a dramatic change. It was the small, specific change of a person who has been certain about something and has just become uncertain about it. His jaw did a thing. His eyes went to the data, and then away and then back. "How long has this been running?" Glenn said. About 8 minutes. Are they in? Not yet. Maybe 4 minutes, based on the rate. Glenn was already on his phone. What happened in the next 7 minutes was not visible from the lobby. Harold knew some of it because Glenn came back down twice and told him things, and some of it he inferred from the change in the ambient noise from the third floor. A kind of collective shift in tone, from presentation cadence to something faster and lower. The demonstration was paused. The audience was told there was a brief technical adjustment. The platform was taken offline at the authentication layer, which was exactly the layer Harold had described in the executive summary on page 1. The intrusion attempt hit a disconnected endpoint. Nothing happened. In a different version of this, something happened. Harold sat back down next to Penny on the bench. "You okay?" Penny said. "Yeah. What was wrong?" Harold thought about how to explain it to a 9-year-old who had been reading about Krakatoa. "You know how Krakatoa made that sound that went all the way to Australia?" he said. Penny nodded. "There was a crack," Harold said. "I found a crack. We fixed it before it went anywhere." Penny thought about this. Was it a big crack? Harold thought about 400 logistics executives, live production data, real authentication tokens, and a gap in the validation layer that had been active and untested for an unknown period of time. "It would have been loud," he said. Catherine Holt came down from the third floor at 10 minutes after 3. The demonstration had resumed successfully after a 40-minute delay that had been communicated to the audience as a scheduled infrastructure verification. Most people had used the time to check their phones. A few had gotten coffee. She walked across the lobby toward Harold and stopped. Penny had fallen asleep on the bench with the volcano book open on her lap. Catherine Holt looked at the sleeping child for a moment. Then she looked at Harold. She was not the kind of person who said, "I'm sorry," easily. Harold could tell that about her from the way she stood, from the way her first instinct was to say something that was not quite it. "Glenn says you had less than 4 minutes," she said. "Approximately. Could have been 5. She was quiet for a moment. "Your report," she said, "the thumb drive. Parker told me he put it in a drawer." Harold didn't say anything. "He told me this afternoon," she said, "after Glenn called me down." Harold looked at the drawer that was not actually visible from where they were standing, but that existed somewhere on the third floor, in a desk that belonged to a young man named Parker, who was very good at absorbing things and not always good at reading them. "The intake portal," Catherine Holt said. "You mentioned it wasn't logging submissions correctly. Page 3. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Why did you come?" she said. "You submitted the report. You followed up. Nobody called you back." "Why not just?" She stopped. "You could have just let it happen." It was an honest question. Harold answered it honestly. "I have a kid," he said. "She watches me make decisions. I try to make ones I can explain to her later." Catherine Holt looked at Penny again. "She's been asleep for 20 minutes, Harold said. "She was up late. She's been reading about volcanic eruptions." "How old?" 9. There was a silence between them that was not hostile. It was the silence of two people recalibrating. "I owe you an apology," Catherine Holt said. "I looked at your bag and I made a decision. It wasn't a good one." Harold considered this. "You were 90 minutes from a major demonstration," he said. "I understand the calculation. That's not an excuse." "No," Harold agreed. "It's not." She reached into her blazer pocket and took out a card. "I'd like to bring you in as a formal reviewer for the platform," she said. "Paid engagement. Scope to be defined, but I want you to go through everything, not just what you flagged. Everything." Harold took the card. He looked at it for a moment. "I'll send you a proposal." He said, "Good." She paused. "Mr. Sutton." "Harold." She seemed to settle on something. "The intake portal issue. The one where your report didn't log. Who else might have submitted things that went into a drawer?" Harold looked at her. "That's the right question," he said. Catherine Holt nodded slowly. "I know." She said goodnight to Penny, who was still asleep, and crossed the lobby and went back to her 3 credential badges and her $40 million platform and her 400 infrastructure executives. Harold sat beside his daughter. He didn't wake her right away. He let her sleep for another few minutes, because she'd been up late, and she'd come along without complaint. And she had trusted him to come back when he said he would, and she had been right to. And sometimes the best thing you can do for the people who trust you is let them sleep a little longer before you take them back out into the evening. He zipped up the laptop bag. The zip tie held. Outside, Cleveland was doing what Cleveland does in April, half-heartedly deciding whether to be cold or not. The light was flat and gray, and the kind of gray that isn't unfriendly, just honest. Harold put his hand gently on Penny's shoulder. "Hey, Bug," he said quietly. "Time to go." Penny stirred. She blinked at the lobby lights and looked at her father, and then at the book still open on her lap. "Did you fix it?" she asked, the way children ask questions when they're half asleep and already know the answer. Harold picked up the volcano book and put it back in her ladybug bug backpack. "Yeah," he said. "We fixed it."